There's a forgotten stew Cowboys used to make out here on the Caprock that used every part of a freshly slaughtered calf a man could put a fork to, including the tube that connects a calf's two stomachs, still carrying a little partly digested milk inside it. That tube is what gave the stew its flavor. The reporters called it barbaric. The men eating it just called it supper, and the polite version of the name is son of a gun stew. My great-great-grandfather Ransom McCall wrote his first trail entry in 1868. What he ate on that drive, what the cook fed 12 men on a wagon crossing the Red River, is written on the second page of a tally book sitting on my kitchen table, and almost none of it is the food you've seen in movies. Modern science now says the men eating it were probably healthier than the ones eating the steak Hollywood keeps selling you. That's number 14 on this list. Number 3 is a bowl of broth restaurants charge $12 for today that a trail cook was making free out of leftover bones 150 years earlier. And number 1 is the thing that was actually feeding these men more than any single dish. And once you hear it, everything above it on this list starts making a whole lot more sense. 25 forgotten meals Cowboys actually ate in the Wild West. We're starting at 25. Number 25, Prairie Oysters. This is the dish that separated the actual West from what the East imagined it was. Prairie oysters were not shellfish. They were calf testicles taken during the spring roundups when the young bulls were castrated. A cook who knew his business would peel away the outer membrane, slice the meat thin, dredge it in flour, and drop it into hot lard until it came out golden. The flavor was mild and near sweet with a tender texture that surprised the first-timers. And Cowboys considered them a seasonal treat available only during branding, when the work was at its hardest and the reward was needed most. Eastern journalists who came out in the 1880s wrote scandalized dispatches back to Boston about the whole business, and the ranch hands ate prairie oysters with real relish, because wasting any part of the animal was simply not done. Number 24, coffee gravy. When the chuck wagon was short on milk, and it almost always was, a good cook made do with what was on the shelf. Coffee gravy started with the pan drippings off the morning bacon, thickened up with a spoon of flour, and loosened out with the leftover coffee from the pot. What you ended up with was a dark, bitter gravy that went over biscuits and salt pork alike. A man raised on his mother's cream gravy would wince at the first bite, and after a week on the trail, he would call coffee gravy a piece of genius. The caffeine gave him a little push, and the fat gave him the calories to work through a brutal day. When the Federal Writers Project went around collecting oral histories from aging cowboys in the 1930s, they found old men still making coffee gravy in their own kitchens decades after the last big drive ended. Number 23, bear sign. When a trail cook really wanted to be popular around a fire, he made bear sign. These were fried donuts. Simple rounds of sweetened dough dropped into hot lard until they puffed up golden and crisp and rolled in sugar while they were still warm. Making bear sign called for time and patience and a generous supply of lard. 3 things not every cook could afford to spend on a single meal. When word got down the drive that tonight's dessert was going to be bear sign, the men worked faster and pushed harder, knowing what was waiting at the end of the day. A cook who could make good bear sign owned that crew for the rest of the drive. Number 22, Pecos strawberries. Real strawberries out on the plains were pure fantasy, and beans were everywhere, and Cowboys built a dry humor around what they were eating. Pecos strawberries was the trail name for a plain pot of red beans served so often that a man might as well be eating fruit. The beans got soaked overnight and then simmered for hours with whatever the cook could find, whether that was salt pork or chili peppers or wild onions or just plain salt and water. A single serving was giving a man near 15 grams of protein, which was critical fuel for a body burning thousands of calories in the saddle. Diaries out of the Goodnight Loving Trail record Cowboys eating beans at every meal for 30 days in a row. That chuck wagon, Goodnight built in 1866, was more than a kitchen. It was a pharmacy and a tool shed and a morale station rolled together. And any cowboy who reached into the chuck box without asking took a ladle across the knuckles or worse. Beans were the price of that whole system holding together for 2,000 miles. Number 21, skunk egg stew. Onions were precious out on the trail, flavorful and long-lasting enough to survive weeks in the supply wagon. Cowboys called them skunk eggs, and any dish that featured them prominently ended up with a name. Skunk egg stew usually combined potatoes and onions and whatever meat was on hand, simmered together until everything softened into a thick, fragrant mass. The onions provided a flavor that salt pork could not match on its own, and they lifted simple ingredients into something that actually tasted like a proper dinner. Cowboys who had grown up on farms often remembered skunk egg stew as the closest the trail ever came to their own mother's cooking, and 800 miles from a home place. That kind of comfort is not a small thing. Number 20, hardtack. Before there was refrigeration, hardtack was the thing that kept men alive from one end of the frontier to the other. It was a dense little square of flour and water baked until every drop of moisture in it was gone, and it would sit in a saddlebag for a year and never go off. The Army was handing them out at a rate of 9 crackers a day through the Civil War, and when those same soldiers came west after the war and turned into cowboys, they brought the habit with them. The men called them sheet iron and worm castles and tooth dullers, and they were hard enough that a cowboy would soak one in his coffee for 20 minutes just to get his teeth into it. Some cooks would crumble hardtack into bacon grease and fry the whole mess into something called skilligalee. One cracker gave a man about 75 calories, which is not nothing when the wagon is running late and there is nothing else on the plate. Number 19, Sowbelly and beans. The backbone of the whole cowboy diet came west in wooden barrels packed down in salt. Sowbelly is the cured belly of the hog, and it would travel for months without a scrap of ice, and the cook would slice it thick and fry it till the fat rendered crisp, and the beans went straight into the same pan to soak up all that drippings. By 1880, a pound of salt pork was running about 12 cents at a frontier trading post, cheap enough that a foreman was budgeting near $200 a month to feed a crew of 12. The beans, mostly pintos or plain brown beans, came out in 100-pound sacks and got rationed hard across a long drive. The smell of Sowbelly frying on the prairie of an evening was what told a tired cowboy that supper was close. It was greasy and salty and the same meal night after night, and it delivered the fat and the protein a working man burned through in a day. Number 18, spotted pup. When the cook wanted to lift the mood around a fire, he reached for rice and raisins. Spotted pup was the cowboy version of a dessert, a simple pudding of rice boiled down and studded through with plump raisins and sweetened with molasses or a spoon of brown sugar. The dark raisins scattered through the pale rice were what gave the dish its name. A 10-pound box of raisins was going for about 90 cents in Abilene and would last a crew through 2 weeks of driving. Cowboys who wrote their memoirs 40 years later still talked about spotted pup with a real fondness, and one hand off the Chisholm Trail called it the closest thing to home cooking his outfit ever tasted. When supplies were running thin, the cook would stretch the raisins out, and the men would sit there and count the ones on their plate. Number 17, corn dodgers. When flour ran short or cost too much, Cornmeal stepped in to take its place. Corn dodgers were dense, little cakes of cornmeal and salt and water shaped up by hand and fried in bacon grease or baked on a hot flat rock beside the fire, and they came out heavy enough to anchor a meal when there was nothing else to be had. Cornmeal was running about half the price of wheat flour at a frontier trading post, and a 50-pound sack could stretch for weeks if the cook knew what he was doing. The texture was gritty and the flavor was plain, and a corn dodger would soak up gravy and bean liquor better than about anything else on the wagon. Cowboys stuffed the cold ones in their pockets for the long hours between meals, gnawing on them while they pushed cattle through the arroyos and across the swollen creeks. Some cooks would work a spoon of molasses or a little crumbled bacon into the batter, small luxuries a man remembered for years. Number 16, fried salt pork with red-eye gravy. When a cowboy wanted something that passed for a proper breakfast, the cook went to the salt pork and the strong coffee. Thick slices of the cured pork went into the pan until the edges curled up and browned, and while the pan was still going, the cook poured a good slug of black coffee straight into it and scraped up every bit of the caramelized fond off the bottom. The whole thing bubbled down into a thin reddish gravy that took its name from what it looked like in the pan. The bite of the coffee cut through the heavy salt of the pork, and it came out about balanced. It called for nothing that was not already in the chuck box, and it felt like generosity all the same. Number 15, vinegar pie. Fresh fruit was near impossible to keep on the trail, and cowboys still wanted a little sweetness at the end of a meal. Vinegar pie solved the problem with pantry staples that traveled without spoiling. The cook mixed vinegar and sugar and eggs and flour with a little vanilla or nutmeg into a filling that came out of the oven, tasting remarkably like a lemon pie. The acid in the vinegar mimicked citrus well enough to fool an exhausted tongue, and what showed up on the tin plate was tangy and sweet and smooth, which was a revelation after weeks of heavy starches and salt. The food chemists now can explain exactly why the acid fools the tongue that way, and the trail cooks of 1875 had it worked out at the Wagon without a laboratory in sight. Number 14, Son of a Gun Stew. This is the dish that shocked the Eastern visitors and kept the Western Cowboys alive. Son of a Gun Stew, known by a considerably saltier name around the actual campfires, used every edible part of a freshly slaughtered calf, meaning the heart and the liver and the sweetbreads and the tongue and the brains and the eyes and the marrow gut, which is the tube between the two stomachs of a young calf that still holds partially digested milk. That marrow gut was what gave the whole stew its distinctive richness, a creamy near sweet quality that no other ingredient in the Wagon could replicate. The cook simmered all of it down with onions and chili peppers until the mixture thickened up into something deeply flavored, and Cowboys treated Son of a Gun Stew as a celebration, made only when fresh beef was available. Modern nutrition science now confirms that the men eating this dish were getting concentrated doses of vitamin A and B12 and iron and zinc, which are the exact nutrients a body burns out under heavy physical labor. Eating nose to tail was not a trend on those drives, it was Tuesday. Number 13, Sourdough Biscuits. The sourdough starter was the single most valuable thing in any chuck wagon. Cooks guarded their crocks of fermented flour and water with about the same devotion a man might show a family Bible, and they kept the starter warm against their own body on cold nights so the wild yeast in it would not die. Every morning the cook would pull off a portion, mix it up with flour and lard and a pinch of baking soda, and bake the biscuits in a Dutch oven buried down in the coals. What came out was tangy and flaky and better than anything you could make with a packet of store yeast. When a starter died from cold or contamination, it was a real crisis. And some of those starters traveled thousands of miles across dozens of drives, passed from cook to cook like a living heirloom. Number 12, Jerky. Long before the vacuum-sealed bags at the gas station, jerky was survival itself. Cowboys cut beef into thin strips, salted it heavy, and dried it in the sun or over a low smoke until every bit of the moisture was out of it and the meat was dark and leathery. Properly made jerky would keep for months without so much as a cold cellar. Trail hands stuffed the strips into their saddlebags for the long hours between meals, chewing slowly to pull every bit of flavor and nutrition out of a piece. The technique came out of the indigenous peoples of this country, who had perfected it over centuries of moving with the buffalo, and a pound of dried meat could carry a man through a full day in the saddle. Number 11, stewed dried apples. Dried apples traveled out west in burlap sacks that could take weeks of jostling in the supply wagon, and when the cook wanted to break the monotony of the plates, he simmered those leathery rings in water with sugar and a little cinnamon until they plumped back up into something that near resembled fresh fruit. The men who had eaten nothing but meat and beans for weeks would close their eyes at the first bite and remember the orchards back home. By 1875, dried apples were running about 10 cents a pound at a frontier general store, cheap enough that even a tight-fisted trail boss put them on the supply list. Number 10, Pan de Campo. Down along the Texas-Mexico border, the vaquero tradition shaped how cowboys ate as much as anything that came out of the East. Pan de Campo, which means camp bread, was a simple flatbread made from flour and lard and baking powder and salt and water, and it cooked in a Dutch oven or straight on a flat rock at the edge of the fire, and it came out chewy and a little charred and perfect for scooping up beans or sopping up gravy. The technique called for no rising time and no careful kneading, and a decent cook could turn out fresh bread in under 20 minutes if the fire was right. Mexican and Anglo cowboys traded that recipe back and forth for generations, adapting it to whatever was on hand in the wagon. Number 9, chuck wagon chili. The chili the cowboys actually ate bore almost no resemblance to what wins the competitions today. Trail chili was primarily meat, usually beef or venison, stewed down with dried chili peppers and garlic and onions and cumin, and beans, when they showed up at all, were served on the side rather than mixed in. The dish traces back to the chili con carne of San Antonio, where Mexican and Anglo foodways collided into something new. By the 1880s, the chili queens of San Antonio were selling their versions from open-air stands in Military Plaza, and the cowboys who passed through carried the taste back to ranches all across the West. The heat of the peppers preserved the meat a little and masked any off flavors developing in the days before refrigeration. Number 8, canned tomatoes. When canning technology got cheap enough in the 1870s, tin cans transformed what came out of a chuck wagon. Cowboys ate the tomatoes cold, straight out of the can as a refreshing break from all the heavy starches, and they ate them stewed with rice, and they mixed them into the beans. The acid of the tomato cut clean through the grease of the fried pork, and the vitamin C in them helped hold off the scurvy that stalked long drives when fresh produce was impossible. Diaries out of the 1880s record cowboys fighting over the last tin of tomatoes in the wagon, treating them like they were a precious luxury and not an ordinary vegetable. Number 7, cornmeal mush. When supplies were running desperately low, cornmeal mush kept the men alive. The cook boiled the cornmeal in water until it thickened into a heavy porridge and served it plain, or when he could, topped with molasses or a spoon of bacon drippings. The dish was filling in the way that only starch is filling, sitting heavy in a man's stomach and giving him hours of slow-burning energy, and it was also deeply and profoundly boring. The men choked it down because the alternative was nothing at all. Cornmeal mush was the floor of cowboy cooking, the meal that showed up when everything else had failed, and its presence on a plate was never welcome and always accepted. Number 6, biscuits and gravy. The combination that would go on to become a Southern diner staple started around cowboy campfires. Fresh biscuits still warm out of the Dutch oven were split open and drowned in a cream gravy made from pan drippings and flour and milk when there was any, or coffee and water when there was not. The gravy stretched an expensive ingredient a whole lot further, turning a few biscuits into a proper meal. Cowboys ate biscuits and gravy for breakfast and for lunch and sometimes for supper too. What washed all of it down was coffee, always coffee, sometimes as much as a gallon per man per day on a hard drive. Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee dominated the frontier market so completely that cowboys used the word Arbuckles as a generic term for coffee itself. The beans came pre-roasted and coated in an egg and sugar glaze, and every package had a peppermint stick in it, and the cowboy who agreed to grind the beans for the cook got to keep the candy. A cowboy without his coffee was a cowboy who might not make it through the day. Number 5, molasses on everything. Molasses was the liquid gold of the chuck wagon, a sweetener that traveled well and lasted forever and improved almost everything it touched. Cowboys poured it over biscuits and stirred it into coffee and mixed it right into beans and drizzled it over cornmeal mush to make the bland palatable. A gallon of sorghum molasses was running about 40 cents at frontier prices, cheap enough to buy in real quantity. Trail cooks learned to guard the molasses crock carefully because cowboys were known to sneak spoonfuls when nobody was watching, treating it like candy in a world where actual candy almost never appeared. Number 4, fried calf brains. Like the Prairie oysters, calf brains showed up during roundup season when fresh organs were briefly available. The cook soaked the brains in salted water to firm them up, then sliced and fried them in butter or lard until they came out golden. The texture was creamy and near custard-like, with a mild flavor that took well to a little seasoning. Cowboys ate them, scrambled with eggs, or served alongside biscuits as a protein-rich breakfast, and the frontier cowboys viewed brains as a delicacy far more interesting than another plate of beans. What killed the dish in the end was the industrial meat processing that made those organs harder to come by, and a campfire treat became almost completely forgotten inside of a generation or two. Number 3, marrow bone soup. This is the secret ingredient that modern chefs are rediscovering and charging premium prices for. When a cow was slaughtered on the trail, the experienced cooks saved the leg bones and cracked them open to expose the marrow, and they simmered those bones for hours until they released their collagen and their fat and their minerals into what had been plain water. Cowboys recovering from an illness got marrow bone soup to rebuild their strength, and men who had pushed too hard or ridden too far found real healing in that simple bowl. The technique came out of indigenous cooking traditions that had been running for thousands of years, and what health food stores now sell as bone broth for $8 a cup was standard trail medicine in 1878. The Cowboys did not need a study to tell them that bones held something powerful. They had eyes, and they watched a sick man get up out of his bedroll and climb back on a horse. Number 2, Hangtown Fry. Born out of the California gold rush and spread by the miners who later turned into cowboys, Hangtown Fry was the most extravagant thing the frontier could put on a plate. Fried oysters and bacon and eggs came together into a rich scramble, and the whole plate cost more than a working man made in a day. The dish came out of Placerville, California, which was nicknamed Hangtown for its frequent executions in the gold rush years. The legend is that a miner who had just struck it rich walked into a saloon and demanded the most expensive breakfast possible, and the cook combined the 3 costliest ingredients he had. Cowboys who passed through California carried the recipe back east and prepared simplified versions when canned oysters started showing up in the supply wagons. Hangtown Fry was aspiration on a plate, a taste of wealth and comfort in a life otherwise defined by hard work. Now, you should know who is telling you all of this. My name is John Ransom McCall, though nobody has called me anything but Johnny since I was 9 years old, and nobody is ever going to call me John. I am 68 years old, and my people have worked cattle in Texas since the year after the war ended. We have been on this particular piece of the Caprock in Armstrong County since 1901, about 20 miles from where Charles Goodnight laid out the old J.A. range in 1876. I have never lived anywhere else, and I do not intend to start. On my kitchen table right now is a tally book that has 3 hands in it. My great-great-grandfather Ransom wrote the first pages of it in 1868, and he could barely write. My grandfather Cull copied the whole thing out in the winter of 1934 because the originals were coming apart in his hands. And I copied every page of it over again in the winter of 1979 at his kitchen table because he would not hand it to me until I had done it. It took me 4 months, and I complained the whole time, and I would give a year of my life to complain to him about it one more time. That book is where the meals on this list came from, and it is also where number 1 came from. Number 1, coffee and whatever you have got. When the beans ran out, there was cornmeal. When the cornmeal ran out, there was hardtack. When even the hardtack ran out, there was coffee, hot and bitter and strong enough to make a man believe he could climb back in the saddle and ride another day. That was not cuisine. It was survival raised up to an art form. The cowboys who built the American West did not eat well by anybody's modern measure, and they ate smart, and that made all the difference in the world. What Hollywood put on the screen for 80 years, the steaks under the stars and the coffee sipped from a proper china cup, none of that ever fed this country. What is on this list did. What actually dies is not the recipes. There are plenty of recipes. What dies is the men who knew why the marrow gut mattered in a son of a gun stew, why the starter had to be kept warm against a body on a freezing night, why the coffee pot went on before the sun did. Those men are gone, and what they knew went with them. So my challenge to you is this: pick one and cook it. Do not just read about it, actually cook it. Put a spoon of leftover coffee into your gravy tomorrow the way a trail cook would have done. Simmer marrow bones for 6 hours and drink the broth before you spend another $8 for it at a store. Make spotted pup with rice and raisins and molasses and tell me in the comments whether it was the saddest thing you ever tasted or whether it fed you the way it fed those men. And if your family ever worked cattle on any ranch, in any county, ask your people what stories survived. What did your granddad eat on his first drive? What did his cook call the beans? Most of what fed the West was never written down. It lived in one cook's chuck box at a time, and it went in the ground with him, on every trail from Texas up through Montana. Most of it is gone, and it is not coming back. But some of it is still out there in a family's memory, in the hands of somebody's grandson who watched. Let us get it down before the last one goes. They fed the West. Now let us remember what with.